Okay, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to Scholars Strike for Liberation virtual teaching, How to Be in Solidarity with Iran, Feminist Anti-Imperialist Perspectives. My name is Beverly Bain, coordinator of Scholars Strike for Liberation. Big thanks to those who labor with me to make these online teachings possible. Wad, Judah, Hadley Howe, and Alexandra Jordan. SSL teachings are broadcasted from the traditional ancestral territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. This territory is covered by Treaty 13, the Williams Treaties, and the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. We must note that the Canadian state has never upheld their obligations under these treaties. The very inception of Canada has been marked by the violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples and the brutal enslavement of African peoples. This colonial violence and settler colonial violence is ongoing to this day. We are gathering here today as part of our obligation to take care of each other, the land, and the creatures we share it with. I'll now introduce you to our moderator for this evening's teaching and also to welcome all our guests. Our moderator is Geeta Hashimi. Geeta is a refugee from Iran, a transdisciplinary artist and curator on the Dish with One Spoon territory. In 2025, she helped bring Gaza Biennale to Toronto. Geeta, welcome, and thank you for agreeing to moderate. And also thank you to all the guests who are on this panel. Welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you, Beverly, for this introduction and for the acknowledgement of the history of the land that we're all on, and for creating and coordinating the Scholars Strike for Liberation platform and inviting us to share it today. And thank you, the SSL team, for taking care of the back end that's making this gathering possible. And I thank you, the invisible audience out there, for joining us in this conversation, which we collectively hope will offer us, as communities of critical thinkers and activists facing these challenging times, ways of thinking through that are imbued with revolutionary feminist ethics toward a politics of peace, life, and liberation. I'm honored to be here in the company of longtime friends and new allies who agreed to speak today on very short notice. This is an interdisciplinary conversation among feminist, Iran-focused scholars and activists. All of us have spent formative periods of our lives in the Islamic Republic of Iran, or the IRI, a system of governance as distinct from Iran, the country. We often conflate the two, so whenever I mention the IRI, I mean the system, not the country. We have families and friends and communities and memories in Iran that are dear, and we have been experiencing hard emotions as we've witnessed from afar the January uprising and the massacre of the protesters, immediately followed by a campaign of death and destruction from the sky, as that white boy mouthpiece of evil, Hegseth, likes to repeat. It is obvious that the repercussions of the US-Israel war on Iran have extended across the region and are reverberating around the world, particularly impacting the global South. There is an abundance of solid analysis about the illegality of this imperialist war and its consequences for the so-called international rule-based order, and credible reports on its destructive impact on lives and nations. If anyone held any illusions post-Afghanistan, post-Iraq, and post-Syria that the US gives a hoot about liberating any people, or that while Israel is committing genocide in Palestine and now in Lebanon in plain view of the world, it cares two bits about freedom and human rights in Iran, hopefully they have sobered up from that drunken dream by now. In this teaching, we don't want to repeat what we think is abundantly spoken about with regards to US-Israel conniving toward political and economic dominance through regime change plots and destabilizing central states, including Iran and, in fact, the rest of the world. There are excellent and highly informative resources that focus on these topics, and we encourage everyone to read and or listen to these. In our session today, we hope to open a space for thinking about liberation other than as a desired outcome of some geopolitical calculus that privileges status quo politics and repressive state actors. Rather, we set as our task the prioritizing of deeper revolutionary perspectives through a set of urgent questions that we grapple with every day as we feverishly read news sites while we anxiously wait for news from our loved ones. These questions are: how do we suffuse our anti-war and anti-imperialist politics with the ethics of life and liberation? How do we, as feminists, think about this moment of imperialist expansionist warmongering and resist reductive and binary politics? When the very possibility of life is being threatened, why is it important to keep in sight the oppressive nature of the IRI? And indeed, what is the oppressive nature of the IRI? Facing the push to limit our imagination and discourse to primary contradiction with imperialism, what can be the constituent elements of an analysis that allows us to think productively about anti-imperialism and not advocate shut up and put up and the enemy of my enemy is my friend approaches? What are the historically persistent trends and aspirations in Iran toward democratic polity and social justice? What are the dynamics of gender activism, civic activism, and plurinational movements, that is, the movements of stateless nations inside the Iran proper, that we have to be aware of and take as foundation for building a discourse of solidarity with Iran here in the imperial core? Facing patriarchal, militarized brute force of repressive states, from the US to Israel to the IRI, what kinds of resistant culture building can we engage in? The conversation format is that each speaker will present for about 10 minutes. After this, we will have some time for the speakers to ask questions of or to respond to one another and or elaborate some issues further. We will then open it to audience questions, which you may type in the YouTube chat. If you are addressing a specific speaker, please be sure to mention that. I now introduce the speakers only briefly in the interest of time and invite you to read their full bios on the SSL platform website in the order in which they will speak. Shokoufeh Sakhi is an Iranian Canadian scholar activist. In 1992, after spending 8 years in prisons, she arrived in Toronto as a political refugee. She thinks, writes, and teaches on the politics and ethics of resistance, prison, justice, and abolition. Aso Javaheri is a Kurdish historical sociologist, researcher, writer, activist, and international soccer referee from Eastern Kurdistan, Iranian. Her research focuses on political economy, socio-political movements, revolution, class, gender, and the sociology of sports. Niloofar Golkar is an activist, educator, researcher, and writer. She has been involved in the Iranian feminist movement inside Iran and now in exile, and continues to participate in anti-colonial environmental movements in Canada. Nastaran Saremi is an interdisciplinary researcher, art critic, instructor, and environmentalist. Her research explores ongoing social transformations in contemporary Iran, particularly from marginalized perspectives. With that, I invite Shokoufeh to start. Thank you.
Sorry, I had problem unmuting myself. Hello, thank you, dear Gita. Thanks to Scholars Strike for Liberation team and dear Beverly. And hello to all who are with us now or listen later. Today I'm talking here from an abolitionist feminist perspective. To give you a sense of what I'm talking about, I'll give you the name that I gave this presentation. It's called Repression as a Statecraft: How the Islamic Republic Reproduces Itself Through Carcerality. We in the West are familiar with prison industrial complex as overlapping interests of government and industry that uses surveillance, policing, and imprisonment. But we, as a nation, in Canada, for example, have not experienced a thorough carceral state. The carcerality we live here in Canada, even in the securitized public domain, real and digital, after and because of Israel's genocidal war on Palestinians, our experiences here in the West pale and fail miserably compared to what Iranians have lived from the onset of the State of Islamic Republic of Iran. Repression has been literally both the umbilical cord and the lifeline of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Repression as a statecraft, that is, criminalization, prison, surveillance, coercion, and the right to kill is woven into the regime's architecture from day one to now. I'm speaking about repression not as isolated. I'm not speaking about repression as an isolated violation, as if violence happens only when the regime loses control or something happens. But I'm speaking about a governing system that organizes law, security, morality, and everyday life, public and private, through an over-encompassing criminalization of the existence of the majority of its population and control through fear. This machinery began by attacking women's right to self-determination and access to public space, by criminalizing their hair, voice, and body, as well as demoting their cognitive faculty and their emotionality, even their ability as a primary caretaker of their own children. In other words, half of the human texture of Iranian population formally was reduced to an infantilized position under the custody of the state and their male relatives, and that happened right at the beginning. Controlling women was never only about women. It was the early template for governing society through fear, extended from the street to the schools, from the workplace to the homes, from public life into private life. Just as the imposition of mandatory hijab by the regime was never merely about controlling women's dress, but rather a mechanism of asserting control over their full human, legal, political, and economic being, a way to regulate human relationships and gendered power relations in the public and at their homes, in their private relations and in their political relations. Was a means of exerting authority over the entire plural human fabric of that land, not just women. It's a pattern for the whole thing. The denial of women's right to decide over their own existence has laid the groundwork for denying their autonomous participation in the political and economic life of their society. The denial of the right to self-determination and of participation in the authorship of the collective future has been inscribed on the multicolored human body of Iran, forming the very backbone of the Islamic Republic's totalizing rule. one that from the very beginning was applied to the diverse national, ethnic, language, and religious texture of Iranian population. Iran, under the Islamic Republic, became a carceral society. That's what I mean by it's a carceral regime, society, state, a carceral society by criminalizing everything and anything which was deemed other than the centralized Shia Islamic state. And by carceral society, I don't mean only the expanse of prisons. I mean, again, prison logic is spilled into everyday life, a machinery that ties together household patriarchal power dynamic backed by the punitive laws, neighborhood level enforcement, revolutionary courts and the judiciary, intelligence services, morality policing, militias, and layered of security forces so that the state can govern not only through law, but through recruiting parts of the population like the male counterparts of the women, like the husbands and fathers and brothers at home, and manipulating our vulnerability through fear and reward, giving power to one part of the population to control the other part of the population, giving power to the center to control the other nations that they call peripheries. If we go back to the first decade after 1979, we see why this machinery became foundational for the establishment and maintenance of this regime. After the revolution, there was a brief opening, or Bahar Azadi, the spring of freedom, a society full of voices, political parties, unions, student groups, women organizations, ethnic and regional movements, people insisting on direct participation in shaping their collective future. That polarity was the regime's, was the new holding power, ruling body. It was the greatest threat to it because a plural society cannot be held under a single totalizing authority. So the regime's answer was consolidation through the repression, disenfranchising women, reinforcing the practice of already old disenfranchisement of queer and non-heterosexual people, their arrest and execution, sending military troops to repress ethnic national movements, mass imprisonment, torture, executions, and forced confessions. These are all not repression as an exceptional, but as a technology for monopolizing politics. And it took them 10 years with the help of the 8-year war to remove alternatives, spread fear, discipline society, and make public participation feel dangerous. That was how they established the beginning. The Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988 legitimized and expanded the reach of repression. It created a political atmosphere where emergency became permanent, militarization became common sense, and dissent became treason. This pattern repeats because the Islamic Republic reproduces itself through those whole 47-8 years through two recurring modes of repression, two tempos of the same machinery. When the regime feels its survival is in danger, repression becomes fast, public, and spectacular. The politics of shock. In the early 1980s, we had mass arrest, televised forced confessions, and militarized campaigns in the ethnic provinces to its rapid responses, from then to the rapid responses they gave to the Green Movement in 2009, Aban uprising, another uprising, the Jina uprising, and last, the January 2026. These are all have been rapid, throwing out, for example, in the 1988, they were 1980, in the 80s, when they were executing people, they would announce the name or the pseudonyms of the people that they had arrested a couple of days ago, and then they executed them, or in the radio, broadcasting their names, or printing their names and their pictures in the newspaper. In the 2009, that Green Movement, they were throwing out the tortured bodies by the roads for people to see. In 2022, during the Jina movement, they were just shooting, and I mean, it was just showing the power. And the last one that we saw in this January was the show of all of the bodies and bags that to give to spread the fear and to show their might. When the regime feels more secure, however, repression becomes quieter and bureaucratic. Courts, intelligence files, long sentences, targeted disappearance, the politics of routine fear. This is the logic behind 1988 prison. At the end of the war, they closed down the prison, and in complete silence and impunity, complete silence without showing anything, they massacred the remaining thousands of political prisoners of that first decade that they had. That happened right at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. They finished the war, they killed their dissidents in the prison. In the 1990s, we have chain murders and the assassination of dissidents beyond Iran borders. In chain murders, they were assassinating the cultural figures, thinkers, writers, the intellectual body of the artists, the intellectual body of the dissidents. Not mass spectacle, but systemic removal designed to break continuity, memory, leadership, and the future. After the December-January uprising, we saw the classic sequence, the visible violence of killing in the streets, which was not the end, and then we have that, after that, the second wave, arrest, disappearance, torture, coerced confession, and the manufacturing of a narrative meant to erase the meaning of that uprising itself, calling it that it was manufactured by the CIA and Mossad, which actually the CIA and Mossad were feeding to that narrative. So from both sides, they were oppressing, repressing, and destroying the Iranians' agency, their social struggle, and their power. Then comes the war. And then war escalated again. And more, and once more, war becomes the cover that militarizes everything. The imagination of the opposition, the social field, the language people are permitted to speak. It becomes easier for the regime to demand unity, to demand silence, and demand obedience, and to name dissent as treason and to kill. In the last few days, they have executed 4 people, and there are more on the waiting list to be executed. These 4 people were arrested during the last uprising, a couple of them, and before the uprising, and some more actually, and 3 other people have been executed under the name of being traitors and treasons. And that's when carceral logic spills into the streets. Now we have checkpoints right now in Iran. Checkpoints, searches, searching cars being pulled over if they are playing music. People's phones are searched for any social media activity. Gatherings treated as threats. Joy itself is policed as if it were a crime. This is why we have to understand war and repression as intertwined. War does not only destroy buildings, it destroys civic life. It floods the air with fear. War, like repression, intends to reduce our existence to bare survival. And in that atmosphere, the carceral state tightens its grip. If the Islamic Republic is held together by carceral power, then any anti-war response to the US-Israel warmongering, any anti-imperialist response to this war has to stand against this carceral state. Otherwise, this carceral machinery will reproduce itself in a new form. The democratic horizon depends on refusing all fascistic powers and not choosing one against the other. It depends on defending public presence and civic bonds. It depends on defending the right to dissent without criminalization. And it depends on defending the right of all bodies and all lives across gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, political and ideological affiliation to exist with dignity without being policed, disappeared, tortured, or made disposable. This fight for these rights that has been happening within this carceral regime, under all of these things that I was mentioning, just a brief presentation of what the regime is, and people have been opening space for themselves. The social political struggle that the Iranian people had been engaged from the first day to right before this war has been, for me, is mind-boggling because they had opened space for themselves at every corner and every day. In last year, in 2014-04, this last Iranian year, more than 70,000 people have been arrested, and more than 2,000 people have been executed. The fight and resistance have been continuing and going on. We have to I'm trying to say that my question is how to be anti-war without becoming pro-carceral state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shokoufeh Jan. A very important question. I hope we will return to that question as we speak further. Asu.
Thank you so much for holding this panel and giving the opportunity to reflect on Iran in the catastrophic wartime. And thank you, Gita, Beverly, and the other members of the SSL. I would like to start from the Aichi cemetery in 2022, the Jina Mahsa Amini's funeral, the moment Kurdish women took the mandatory veil off while shaking and then burning it, were chanting Jin Jian Azadi, women life freedom. Patriarchy and capital have caused this catastrophe. I drew this frame to take us to two other historical moments in the post-revolution of 1979. The Iranian women's rallies on the International Women's Day on March 8, 1979, when Iranian women took to the streets to say no to the misogynist decrees by Khomeini about women's rights. They were chanting, "We did not make a revolution to get backward. Freedom is global, neither Eastern nor Western. In the dawn of freedom, women's rights are missing." And the second moment was in March 1979, when the IRI was founded by a non-democratic election. All of Kurdistan, including Kurdish cities across various provinces, declared their opposition by boycotting it and holding rallies on the streets while carrying banners of "No to Islamic Republic," "Neither monarchy nor clerical rule," "Bread, work, freedom," "Kurdistan, the graveyard of fascists." At the time, the Kurdistan was called and considered as the last barricade of defense of the revolution, a revolution that started by, at least the most part of that was their radical ideas and the bright promising for future. So the RII consolidated its power not only by suppressing women, non-Persians, Arabs, Kurds, Baluch, Turkmens, and liberal opponents, but also by specifically oppressing anti-imperialist and leftists, including Kurdish parties that had been fighting against the Shah for decades. I talk about Kurds as part of the national oppression polity against non-Persians and also women, since I'm not reading these from the liberal or the so-called bourgeoisie viewpoint. My point is that they should be seen as a part of the whole struggle against capitalism and imperialism. However, not from the third worldism theory or the orthodox and structuralist that led us to take a campist stance. If we accept that capitalism is a totality, so it must be understood in this way. I read Iran in this way, as a local state of the empire of capitalism. It can neither be contingent upon separate elements, nor should it be limited to anti-imperialism and geopolitical rivalries. So defining the IRI as anti-imperialist based on solely its diplomatic friction with the West is what Mixon would call it retreat from class, or the departure from materialist analysis. This perspective separates the political from the economic and considers them as a separate autonomous structure. By focusing on the statist definition of anti-imperialism, certain left circles effectively desocialize the struggle, stripping it of its emancipatory potentials. In reality, the RII uses the anti-imperialist branding to obscure the central social relationship of capitalism, the coercive extraction of surplus value from a domestic population that is denied even the most basic rights to organize. I'm starting with women to explain that capitalist, imperialist, and authoritarian nature of the RII. We should accept that Jina Mahsa Amini identity as a Kurdish woman who lost her life due to the state violence enforcing compulsory hijab and the way she was killed expressed the existing political, economic, social, and cultural order as the whole, as the entity named IRI that is not only not an anti-imperialist but also a capitalist state. We, the leftists, from the different theoretical viewpoints, emphasize women's oppression in capitalist society and call for a struggle against it. So the question is here, how should women's oppression in Iran be understood and read? I'm not portraying Iranian women as victims by bringing up the following points to think about. I'm trying to explain that everyday struggle of women for their rights, the way they have paved since the revolution until now. The compulsory hijab or veil is not just about a small cloth to cover women's hair. Even if it was, a leftist should stand against it, against its mandatory nature. The compulsory hijab has been one of the most prominent manifestations of the ruling ideology of IRI. In fact, a significant part of the system of strict surveillance and control and the disposition of bodily autonomy has been aimed to constructing a specific form of sexual gender identity, namely heterosexual women and men. I would recommend reading Motahari book about women whose ideas have been the ideological basis for the interpretation and writing of the law for women in Iran. The exercise of power, dispositions, and the erasure of women identities are not only functions assigned to compulsory hijab. One also add to exclusion of women from the public sphere. The entanglement of the issue of hijab with women's identity and the responsibilities and duties imposed upon them is deeply intertwined with the gendered division of labor. By sacralizing wifehood and motherhood as muhajjabe women, meant veiled women, a set of responsibilities has been assigned to women that effectively positions them as the primary agents of reproductive labor within the household, where their bodies functions as instruments for reproducing labor power and expanding the workforce. At the same time and alongside the multifunctional performance of the whale, women are imposed with legal and institutional deprivation and violence. Iranian women are not allowed to leave the country without their husband's permission, are not allowed to have a driving license without their husband's permission, and are not allowed to have a job or study without their husband's permission. Iranian women cannot live a normal life, not in the bourgeoisie or liberal definition, with basic rights, like biking a motorcycle or doing sports such as swimming or other beach sports. Yes, women are being killed across the world, and violence against women is universal. But I'm talking about something that is reinforced by the law, institutionalized violence against women. If a woman is killed by his father, the father does not receive a sentence, but a 3-year sentence that is easy to evade. Gendered and sexual oppression, thus, it's not accidental or exceptional for this regime. It is structurally embedded in education, legal framework, labor market, welfare regime, and everyday life. I consider the current silence of the left or defense of IRI as the reductionist methodological approach that reduces and makes it contingent on geopolitical rivalries, and it is the same orthodox logic of the 70s and 80s, specifically post-revolution in Iran. We remember that analysis and political stances in the post-revolutionary Iran during and after the revolution. The left of that period did not fundamentally recognize women's oppression as the base to capitalism and imperialism. Rather, it subsumed it under class struggle or anti-imperialist struggle. The underlying assumption was that if imperialism were defeated or the revolution succeeded, the women question would resolve itself automatically. These constituted a form of reductionism. Gender oppression was reduced to secondary byproduct of class exploitation or foreign domination. Within this framework, any specific demand raised by women could easily be dismissed as the deviation from the main struggle, and it was considered a bourgeoisie struggle. The second axis of my talk is about national oppression against stateless nations in Iran as a multinational country and how this is embedded in the imperialist and capitalist nature of IRI. And specifically, Kurds are experiencing the catastrophic current wartime in the different and multi-layered ways. I would explain why I'm insisting that IRI is neither anti-imperialist nor anti-capitalist later, maybe in the second round. But I'm going back to the second axis. A non-Persian individual in Iran is a non-Persian individual class in Iran is intertwined with his nationality. The centralized capitalist state has been built and expanded on the plunder, extraction, and exploitation of the raw materials from non-Persian regions. Khuzestan oil and gas, the natural resource and its natural resources. Kurdistan natural resources and gold mines, Baluchistan resources, and their strategic locations at borders and ports. In other words, the Iranian capitalist state was not possible without the extraction of resources from those regions, while harshly oppressing, executing, and assimilating them. For example, the vast majority of the cheap labor force immigrants in the metropolises are Kurds and Baluch. Kurdish people broadly are part of the reserve army of labor. The region functions as the reservoir of a cheap and precarious labor. I'm talking about women and men Kulbers in Kurdistan and Sukhbar in Baluchistan. Kulbari is a form of hazardous physical cross-border work by which Kurdish porters transport heavy goods across militarized terrain. It is characterized as the work of this sometime. Of course, I believe the Kulbari phenomenon is not merely a job. It is the ultimate product of the commodification of survival at the borders, where the Kurdistan workers' body, with the Kurdish workers' body is worn down at the lowest possible price. Kurdish National Liberation Movement in Rojhelat, Iran, has historically been influenced by radical ideals, and most of its parties and organizations have been leftist. Meanwhile, they've been massacred, executed, imprisoned, and persecuted, not simply due to standing against the national oppression, but also due to being leftist. My uncle was executed on his birthday simply because he was a communist who refused to order off the repentance from being a communist. But I'm going to go back to know how Kurdish people are experiencing the current wartime. I'm arguing that the Kurdish situation in Iran transcends mere political marginalization. It represents a deeply entrenched state of the statelessness that has long subjected Kurds to a particular form of oppression, exploitation, and violence. Their wartime experience is distinctly different. Unlike other groups in Iran, whose interaction with war may be sporadic or linked to specific geopolitical events, Kurds find themselves on a permanent battlefield where conflict is a constant aspect of their existence. The distinction is significant. It implies that for Kurds, war is not restricted to external clashes between nations or the expansionist ambitions of the current sides, but is profoundly internalized through enduring practices of the state, such as militarization, repression, and the systematic denial of political autonomy. Thus, the Kurdish reality can be analyzed as reflective of the colonial or quasi-colonial dynamic within the state, where central authority monopolizes sovereignty and enforces it through coercion. Historically, Kurds have faced warfare from the Pahlavi monarchy to the Islamic Republic, enduring a continuous array of policies that include forced displacement, assimilation tactics, and violent suppression of dissent. This historical continuity undermines any narrative that represents Kurdish marginalization as a temporary or regime-specific issue. Rather, it positions such marginalization as a fundamental element of state formation in Iran. Action like declaring jihad against Kurdistan post-revolution, conducting cross-border assassination, and the regular killing of Kurds, and those acts are not merely isolated incident, but integral part of the long-standing framework of exploitation and plunder and violence. As a result, everyday life becomes a matter of securitization, where even the most basic economic survival carries life-threatening risk. The correspondence with broader theoretical concept of structural violence, wherein harm is ingrained with political and economic system rather than being limited to overt warfare. So the Kurdish experience of war today is interact and multifaceted. Rojhelat or Eastern Kurdistan, Iranian Kurdistan, is subjected to both external bombardments and internal repression, effectively positioning Kurdish society in the crossfire between international powers and the Iranian state. The situation produces a component vulnerability that sets it apart from other Iranian communities, which may experience state repression but typically do not find themselves in the nexus of multiple military and geopolitical strife. Hence, the Kurdish case illustrates how stateless nations frequently become geopolitical fault lines where international rivalries converge with internal control mechanism. I'm done, and if we have time, I would like to talk about the political economy of Iran and its capitalist nature of the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Asu. We'll return to that, Niloofar.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to the organizers and everybody who's listening. I just came back from US, and what I observed was that nobody of people, no matter of their politics, wants this war from American perspective. Even the alt-right is saying that kind of like, or MAGA saying that the prices are rising and all that, and they like are kind of like against this war. So I'm bringing this to talk about why then having a correct or good politics, anti-war politics is important. And as a feminist, we kind of like push forward the anti-war perspective that is anti-Islamic Republic, but also pushes for the urgency of freedom of political prisoners and end to execution. And the system, the alternative system that we want, is a system that is accountable to the local population, to different people, marginalized groups and identities, women, queer, ethnics, religious minorities, and so on. And so today I'm gonna focus my talk more on political economy of the situation, because there is many people who see kind of like Islamic Republic as resistance, and I want to say why that perspective is wrong. To outside observers, the Islamic regime is superficially defined by its anti-imperialist and anti-Western foreign policy, which its public faces depicted as an anti-corruption champion of the oppressed. Yet, a sober reading of the over 4-decade economic trajectory of the Islamic regime reveals that underneath its sloganeering facade lies an autocratic clerical state system with a sharp militarized capitalist economic orientation. One which has severely intensified under specifically Ahmadinejad's administration and since then. But I'm gonna focus a little bit on Ahmadinejad's era because he kind of like shifted the political economy so much and also created a vast network of non-Iranian leftists in West and East that kind of like create a system of support for his government. And after that, so to unpack that, under Ahmadinejad, the regime's neoliberal economic doctrine and subsidies have developed at an even faster pace, with a crushing effect on social and political movements, particularly the Iranian workers' movement. Two major economic initiatives under Ahmadinejad's administration deserves attention here. Exposing the role champion of the working classes, first is the government's economic reform plan, introduced in March 2008 and followed up with a subsidies rationalization plan. A significant gain by the Iranian working class after the 1979 Iranian Revolution was the constitutionally guaranteed right to make free use of billions of dollars in state subsidies assistance in the areas of gasoline, public transportation, public utility use, among others. But in January 2009, however, this 30-year arrangement ended as the regime began implementing large incremental cuts to national subsidies. Ahmadinejad's subsidies rationalization plan established a price liberalization process that follows International Monetary Fund prescription for neoliberal restructuring. However, this wasn't a neoliberal restructuring, it was the militarized capitalist kind of like restructuring. During that time, we see many of the heads of IRGC resigning from their positions, and they're taking over major economic industries that were used to be public, but now the door to privatization of them opened. Through that, and during the same time, we see intensification of the sanctions that then moves to the energy sector and moves to the industries that IRGCs also took over. And this kind of like created a beginning of the creation of huge wage gap in the society, because we see that the elite is making lots of money, that money is not going through the subsidies back to the people. And then we see that more and more people are falling under poverty line. The middle class is shrinking. Mass majority of them are moving under poverty line, and a small section of it moving into the elite, kind of. And then at the same time, the intensification of sanctions are happening. So then, but then fast forward to the current situation, we have Iranian government created a system to kind of like also go around the sanctions. As you probably know, 90% of the oil was sold to China or being sold to China. There was a mass kind of like relationship with Russia over military goods and kind of like services. And then Venezuela was also a center that was providing logistical support for kind of like the money that's what needed to go around the US system. So now then we have this war that we have three actors. We have the Iranian government, and we have Israel, and we have US. So to put it in perspective, is that US sees Iran as a possible investment for future, but also has kind of like is aiming for those three major points that Iranian economy was functioning while sanctions were there, to also like taking over Iran's oil probably, so China cannot, so US can kind of like control more of the oil. Cutting the Russian military kind of like export-import with Iran. And they have kind of like stopped Venezuela from providing the logistical support for many of the money laundering that was happening. However, we can look at Israel from wanting the land. This issue is not as many of the right-wing Iranians that are like, you can see them in protests that thanking Trump or thanking Netanyahu, is not about freedom of Iranian people. It's about land in Lebanon and in West Bank. We can look at it from that perspective. And obviously, a government that is committing genocide elsewhere can never provide freedom elsewhere. So we have to create a strong stand against Israel too. And then we have Islamic Republic that have shown over and over, as you've listened to Shokoufeh's and Aso's talk, that how oppressive in many, many layers have they been within the populations in Iran and so on. So then the issue about the sanctions is not just the sanctions, about also the corruption of the regime. The huge kind of like wealth gap that you could see all these recent years was like contrasting to the narrative that, oh, there's not enough medicine, there's not enough equipment, medical equipment, and this and that because of the sanctions. I'm like, if it's the sanctions, why we see these extreme luxury condos, cars that you don't even see in Toronto or kind of like major Western cities. You could see in Tehran and some other major cities. And so it was showing that there is a population that have access to extreme amount of wealth, extreme corruption of the government, that then was using that money that during Ahmadinejad was released to be used in public sector, but like militarized sector, to be used for not the good of the public. And that is why that you see every few years major uprisings and more intensified uprising, and also the government that was taking arms against its own people in a more violent way. If in 2009 uprising against Ahmadinejad, there was only around roughly 100 people got killed. The few years after that, in the other uprising, the numbers went up to 1,000. And in the past January, like thousands and thousands of people got massacred within 2-3 days. So then this anti-war, anti-Islamic Republic kind of like perspective cannot be separated, especially as I mentioned, within if you look at the political economy of the situation, the regime is a very capitalist, militarized regime. So we cannot kind of like separate the anti-imperialism from anti-capitalism. And if we do that, then we see these networks that are active, especially within the left in North America, South America, and Europe, that are kind of like create narrative of impunity for the government, atrocities against people in Iran, and kind of like the social movements. And I kind of like stop my talk here, and we'll get back to these points later. Thank you.
Thank you, Niloofar. Nastaran?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Gita, Alessandra, and Beverly for having me here. And before I begin, I just want to say that this short piece that I have prepared for the panel comes from my very embodied fear and sense of unsettlement. So please forgive me if it sometimes seems abstract or delusional, which now I feel after talks of all my comrades, I feel like maybe it's not too bad to close the panel with something more, let's say, abstract. So, and then having the privilege of speaking last, I want to build on what my colleagues have already so powerfully articulated. I mean, they powerfully and beautifully provided historical context for the reflections on the various dimensions of the condition of this ongoing catastrophe that we're living through. But for the sake of time, I will focus my brief remarks on the environmental dimensions of ongoing wars, both in the region and globally speaking, as perhaps as a way of opening toward what I would call an affirmative anti-war position for us as feminist scholars and activists. As is increasingly discussed across multiple media outlets, the environmental costs of war are not distant or secondary to its human toll. They're immediate, measurable, and on a scale comparable to the annual emissions of entire countries on the planet. Climate scientists warn that these emissions are likely to rise significantly if the conflicts continue. Key drivers include the intensified production of weapons and military equipment, fires and leaks from damaged oil infrastructure, and the expansion of military involvement across multiple states in the region. To add on that, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which is the critical global energy route has further disrupted oil and gas supply chains with far-reaching environmental consequences. Yet, as you might also feel, this language often strikes me as overly technical, as if we're calculating the costs and benefits of conflict for different parties involved. Such framing does not do justice to what is unfolding, especially when if we approach it from a politicized understanding of the fate of life and humanity on a planetary scale. Perhaps it is more honest, and I would say more feminist, for me to return to the fear that I'm carrying in my body these days, a fear that seems to expand every second, which is, unfortunately, the fear of the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe in the region. If such a catastrophe were to occur, God forbid, it would not recognize the borders through which we so often think, nor the deeply internalized frameworks of methodological nationalism that separate us from others. It would exceed all of that. What we're witnessing on the horizon can be understood as the potential culmination of a long, destructive arms and nuclear race. Speaking of nuclear catastrophe, I want to hear reference Giorgio Agamben, who revisited earlier debates on atomic war and confirms that humanity now faces the real possibility of annihilating itself and all life on Earth. Rather than treating catastrophe as an exceptional event, he argues we must see it as ongoing and embedded in our political reality, a threat that has been normalized, trivialized, and reduced to just another risk to be managed by experts. Unlike previous modernist views, he emphasizes that humanity does not actually control its power of self-destruction. That actually the power is not in our power, pointing to a possibility of which we are not masters, left instead to the contingency of largely random decisions made by head of the states. Our power as a human community remains a power that cannot be empowered, a community that can be suppressed but not affirmed, or only affirmed after its disappearance through a void impossible to grasp, something that cannot even be destroyed because in effect, it does not yet exist as a unified, self-aware subject capable of acting. This might also speak to the limitations, contradictions, and impasses that global and regional solidarity movements are facing at the moment, in the absence of mutual, let alone universal understanding of the human condition. Getting back to the ongoing war within the region, I must repeat that, as we all know, Israel and Pakistan are already nuclear powers, and that Iran too has spent decades developing its nuclear capacities, for which it has been persistently targeted, as we all know. I'm not an expert in energy, military strategy, or geopolitics, so I will not dwell there. I will leave this at the level of fear that I already shared and return instead to what these conditions are already imposing on life. We have witnessed the deliberate degradation of land and environment through military hostility and regimes of occupation for so long across the region, from the uprooting of olive trees across occupied Palestine and Afrin to the burning of oak forests across the Zagros Mountains and so on. And yet, even this imagery does not fully capture what is being done to the land itself. To elaborate what I mean by land here, which is a web of life, I want to turn to a few passages by a Lebanese writer, Nawar Jabour, that I came across recently in this brilliant piece, Erasing the South on Coordinate at a Time, One Coordinate at a Time. Here he writes, as Israeli evacuation orders continue to be issued, warning of demolition of border villages in southern Lebanon are prohibiting residents from returning. This no longer appears as a military procedure or a security measure. It reads instead as a deliberate attempt to erase people's existence by uprooting them from their places. This uprooting frames everyone present as expandable, as if the land is something to be seized, buried, and annihilated. What is being targeted here is not only the place itself, but the relationship that binds people to their land. It is as though what is unfolding forces a redefinition of land, not as property or geography, but as a condition for what life can be. In parallel, land is framed within the discourse of resistance according to a different logic, as a defensive position, a strategic depth, a line of contact. Within this shift, people's questions and rights are deferred, and land is understood through the lens of conflict rather than life. Its value becomes tied to its military function, not to the lives, relationships, and meanings it holds. As if the people within it are an excess, the land appears subject to a logic that knows its worth in war, yet loses its value in life. I just want to quickly mention that I do not intend, by this comparison, I do not intend to flatten all parties as equally responsible. We know the entity that continues the Nakba, apartheid, and colonial occupation all too well. Rather, I want to highlight that what is framed as resistance shouldn't be reduced to the absolute militarization of the opposing side, fully subordinated to the imperatives and logic of the authoritarian state, such as Iranian regime. In such context, imperialism is not simply about territorial domination. It is a global regime that normalizes and distributes conditions of war, crisis, and destruction unevenly. Through this regime, the end that previously I referred to through Agamben, this end becomes a lived reality for some populations while remaining an abstract possibility for others. It is not just political domination. It organizes its eco-fascist agenda against life itself. It imposes this on land and communities at the same time. This implies that anti-war politics must also be anti-imperialist and eco-feminist at the same time, because the same system governs both ecological and social destruction. I have already referenced Agamben's pessimistic view on the absence of human community under such conditions. However, in the face of what I would call the regional operationalization of the global war regime, which shapes everyday life structures, the economy and social relations and governance itself, it becomes crucial to ask, what would an affirmative anti-war feminist politics look like, and what conditions makes it possible? I want to raise a few points here, fully aware that they remain sketchy and provisional. The first step to me is to refuse the irrational drives of global capital and all their manifestation through state-run, operationally fanatical apparatus, and to begin reclaiming the notion of resistance through life itself. This entails embracing practices that emerge from and sustain the nexus of life, which in turn requires a conscious exodus from any state-led exercises of control over life and land. What are these networks of anti-fascist and eco-feminist practices on the ground? Well, of course, like everyone else, I can only carry forward the small seeds of what I have been touched by and cared for in my own life. Here, I want to highlight two sets of life-protecting practices across Iran, Kurdistan, and beyond. I say beyond because I'm aware, I acknowledge that it exists everywhere, but I only have firsthand experiences from these two contexts. The first set is Dadkhahi, involves justice-seeking acts by those who search for loved ones among the rubbles of authoritarian regimes, mass graves, abandoned cemeteries, and landfills. The second set consists of those who care for the land and its life-sustaining forces. In Kurdish, there's a beautiful term we use for those who have sacrificed their life to protect the oak forest. We call them Shahidan Jinge and Jian. Jinge in Kurdish means what holds life, and Jian also means life and share its root with Jen, which means woman. This is the same perspective that Xinjiang Azadi comes from. These practices, seemingly distinct, are inherently interlinked. They allow us to build empowered, sustainable communities not only visible through their destruction, but actively engaged with the land and all that sustain lives. From this perspective, we claim all lives affected by war, not only those who lost in the immediate conflict that is ongoing, but also those endangered by the long-lasting militarization of our lands. Every living being, every grain of sand that nurtures life, as well as the networks of care and solidarity that these practices generate, that help self-determining our collective lives as well. These practices are vital in imagining any anti-war and anti-militarization politics, as they not only advocate for life and sustain life, but also help rebuild communities of people who have been reduced to coordinates, nodes, or data points within military operations and an imperial data-driven media landscape, systems that have become more intertwined and indistinguishable than ever. This imagination transcends borders, ideologies, and camps. It remains vigilant, in Walter Benjamin's words, at a moment when revolutionary action is nothing more than pulling the emergency brake, a moment to pause, not to advance, but to duel, to build a community-driven yet network movements against this insane militarization and nuclear race, and to reclaim our lives as a human community inseparable from the lands that sustain us. Yeah, I leave it here, and hopefully we can get back to the discussion if it's needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasaran. That was, in fact, a really great way to end our first round, as we came back full circle to what Shokoufeh started us with life and the protection of life. And along the way, we went through a pretty informative journey about the material conditions in Iran. So I'd like to invite the speakers. If I know that both Niloofar and Asu mentioned that you wanted to expand on some of your points. So if we can start from there, if you wanted to expand some points, or we can respond if you have other people have responses to offer to other speakers. Okay.
I'd like to also expand later.
Yes. Okay. So why don't we start with the points that people wanted to expand? So let's do it in the same order. Shokoufeh, why don't you start? And then we'll go to Asu and Niloofar.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. What I'm going to expand here is that I like to put this war and Iran, all the things that I talked about Iran, within the bigger picture, the picture of the global state that we are in. I like to bring our attention that we are not, if I want to have to make a position, this is my question for myself, and I like, is that where we are right now is not just a war between, two states. We are living in the time that I believe we are actually already in the middle of a World War III, but it's a World War III that is different than the other two, which were the European countries fighting among each other and get to the whole world. This is the war that what we are ongoing wars of state powers against people, against all people, against the living beings. So I'll bring the whole thing of the environment inside it too. What we are here right now, for example, this war that the attack of the Americans and Israelis on Iran, it just spread to the whole region. All the things about repression and repression of the freedom and of expression and all of those is not only happening in Iran, it's happening in every country in the region. People are being arrested. Waves of arrests is happening within the regions right now under exactly the rubrics of the spies for Iran or spies for this or that. And activists are being tortured, or being, like right now, I got this news that in Bahrain, one activist, one person got arrested and killed under torture under the name of suspicion of being a spy. In everywhere in what we have in Israel, we just had they legalized the execution of Palestinian people. So the genocide hasn't stopped there. The war machines, the war in Ukraine, all these things that is happening. Under these things of war, it's everything is falling apart everywhere. Like in England, under the law of what is that here? The arrest of offensive false menacing online messages. For example, in 2023, there were 12,183 arrests, and 1,100, more than 1,100 got conviction. But what it does, it creates this exactly that the atmosphere of intimidation within the society. So what we have here, fascism is rising, and fascism at this time is not connected to one nation. It's more of a fascistic global. Everything is really global right now. We are in a globalized world. All of these, the wars that are happening are not border wars. It's not a territory over the territory. These wars, from the war of the Israel against the body of the Palestinian to now, maybe the last classic war that happened was Russia against Ukraine, that it was through the borders and with soldiers and this and that. But as we are moving to this very fast through these years, is the war of through AI system. So the AI, I'm bringing all of these things together because these are all related. And what does it mean to be anti-war at this time? What does it mean to have an anti-war movement at this time? And it's related to these things that we are at the time that the power, capital, and technology of AI, these are hand in hand. They are practicing their ways of, from every side, Iranian side and the big power, the big imperials. They are practicing, exercising their technology over the body of the people. The need for labor has come down. The need for soldiers, foot soldiers, have come down. And so we are at a place that all these are entangled. So I cannot in a good conscience go out and just talk about war against Iran or be against this war. Have to have I feel like there is a mutual destruction is happening on the body of the planet and all the living things, and response to it, I see it has to be a global movement anti-war for mutual protection of the right to life and the right to existence and right to have the recognition of the bodies of the population of their right to govern their own existence. That's so I don't have an answer, but I see that we are at a time that we can't just sit in the old ways of responding to things that is happening, because it requires, it demands from us all these things that is happening, to just bring the new way of thinking and new way of finding ways and making solidarity. So this is my extension of what I was saying. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shokoufeh. I'd like to invite Aso and Niloofar, but in the interest of leaving some time for Q&A, if you could limit your extensions to about 5 minutes each. Thank you.
I'm trying to be short.
Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about the political economy of Iran and how is ignored as a part of or ally of the empire of capital. If we say empire, the capital empire is an empire without colonies, and while the capital is homeless, and can move across the borders, but still requires an orderly, predictable environment. And this is the role of the states. And the state's role is to provide the legal and administrative framework like property law, contract enforcement, and infrastructure that the market itself cannot create. Now, let's review the IRI political economy that Niloofar explained. I'm not going to explain it a lot, and I want to review it a little bit. I named the privatization policy. Iranian political economy was brought under the structural adjustments, the regulation of work since the late 80s, and became the global ally with the global ally of the empire. And contrary to its self-presentation as an independent actor that we said a state cannot cannot function as independent, the IRI political economy has frequently aligned with global neoliberal trends. In the late 18th, the regime launched its campaign under the guidance of the International Monetary Fund, which includes like the removal of critical subsidies on basic goods. So the government functioned as the essential administrative arm for the specific regime of accumulation. And throughout the IRGC, which is portrayed as a revolutionary and just political organization, through the IRGC and other bunyads or foundations, the state has not rejected the market, but has quasi-privatized it, concentrating banks, energy, and industry into the hands of the ruling military clerical elites. So the IRI is a reactionary capitalist state that implemented IMF aligned neoliberal policies, such as what I mentioned. And I agree with most of scholars who call and describe and explain IRGC as a military and economic conglomerate. It controls the key industries, including oil and gas, petrochemicals, telecommunications, banking, and construction in Iran. Khatam al-Anbiya, the headquarters, is Iran's largest contractor, often securing multi-billion dollars no-bite government project for infrastructure like dams, pipelines, and tunnels. And IRGC has successfully occupied what would call the administrative apparatus of the state, ensuring that most national wealth, including up to half of Iran oil export, is circulated through IRGC-linked network. And IRGC does not just participate in the market, it creates a closed-loop economy where military power is used to eliminate competition and secure capital. And the IRGC role exemplifies, as I said, military administrative capitalism. This was just things I wanted to mention.
Very important. Thank you so much for that, Niloofar.
I want to talk a little bit about the culture of impunity that will be created around if we only have anti-war stand, but not anti-regime stand. And it is like we undermine all the politics from below, we undermine all the social movements that are on the ground if we do that. And like the long history of many vibrant, active forms of resistance and movements that have been happening in the past 4 or 5 decades in Iran that have been gaining a lot. We have gained a lot after Janjian Azadi movement that now feels like have been also vapored with the bombs falling. And I'm sure many other movements that have been building and resisting all these years feeling the same. However, like people are thinking exactly to be more creative and building on and bringing back those narratives and forms of resistance in a more creative way to think how in this horrible situation that we are between bombs and oppressive regime, how we can go forward and keep building and rebuilding. However, if left in the West do not consider the other side, it becomes to the very reductionist narrative that actually push more people towards right-wing politics, because they do not see their bases there. Like you're not talking about the daily realities of people in Iran who are facing these all forms of oppression. What is the difference between somebody who have been killed by a bomb or by a bullet in a protest? Well, I saw a meme on social media that was saying it's only the body bag's color, but also different forms of dehumanization that I've been going through. The families of those who have been massacred had to go and find their loved ones through hundreds rows of bodies on the ground, and or watch their pictures one by one. Like, imagine the psychological warfare that people have to go through to find their loved ones. And you can see same exact imagery in Palestine. The Palestinians who have been killed, their families have to like go through long list of pictures of those who have been killed to find their loved ones. And I'm creating these parallels because there's lots of animosity between these two right now among both Iranians and also the anti-war movement that is pro-Palestine and pro-Palestinians, but is not pro-Iranians and not people in Iran, and kind of like it just creates that division further and further instead of like bringing people together. So that is why that my argument is that actually if we come to this understanding that we have to have a stand, complicated, but also it's not a simple politics. We cannot follow the lazy politics as I want to talk. These things are not simple. If we actually force ourselves to learn this history, learn like what's happening on the ground instead of like pushing it aside and saying that, oh, every government is oppressive to its own people. Oh, here we have also prisons and here we have these are like kind of like if we come to that, actually we can bring more and more people to the anti-war movement, because I hear this argument over and over that we need to lower our standards so more people can come. And I'm saying, no, actually, that is what's creating more divisions, more animosity, and making the anti-war smaller and smaller every day, unfortunately. Although, as I mentioned, for example, to US, I didn't see anybody who were pro-war within the regular people, and so on. So, yeah.
Thank you, Niloofar. Nasaran, I wanted to invite you if you had anything more to add.
Just a quick note, which is not directly related to what I presented here. It just came to my mind during the discussions going on. I feel like one of the major reason of all the disputes over this whole issue of how to stand in solidarity with Iranian people comes from an ongoing dispute over how to historicize this very specific moment that we're at. Of course, there are multiple ways to historicize and periodize the moment that war broke out. I feel like one way would be to trace back the Iran-US conflict to the US-led coup at 1953, with the toppling of Mossadegh state, but also it could be a way to return to the moment of revolution and what happened afterwards. But to me, if we want to think, I mean, to go beyond this methodological nationalism that I always try to avoid, is to see it, to look at what is happening. I mean, this entangling links between these waves of uprising in Iran and this ongoing war against Iranian people and, of course, the Iranian state. I would say we need to trace it back to the I mean, the moment that all these regional tensions started to escalate with the rise of Green Movement and then the wave of Arab Spring. I mean, all the revolutionary uprising across the region. What we've been witnessing since is, it could be, I argue, it could be framed as a sort of state-involved backlash against all these popular uprising across the region. I mean, since the beginning of this wave of uprising, we see all the states involved in all these, in sponsoring terrorist groups, even forming them, and actively engaging in suppressing other nations' uprising across the region, which we saw. I mean, Israel has always been involved, Iran has always been involved, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other nations. So it would be an ethical stand for all of us to acknowledge that. Otherwise, we would fail to see how our struggles are kind of connected on this level, and to see that how the failure, I would claim the failure of the Syrian revolution as my own, because I see that the fate of all these movements are kind of coming together. And one way, I mean, with this flawed discourse around anti-imperialism that cheer for one side and render our people struggles invisible, we would see that this is a kind of flawed politics of solidarity that seeks allies within states, not people. So this is one of the things that I wanted to mention, which is, I know that it's far away from my talk, but I thought it would be great if we can talk about this. I mean, to historicize the moment that we're at. Otherwise, I feel like all these moments, I mean, momentums like the uprising, the wars, would be like nods scattered around without any way to trace them and to make sense of them.
Thank you. I wanted to, there is a question in the chat, which I will bring up, but I wanted to go back to the central question that became the topic of the title of this panel, how to be in solidarity with Iran. So how do we build a solidarity, an anti-war movement that stands in solidarity with the people, not with the states? And where do we start from? As someone who stands on the street regularly, myself, weekly, that's a question in terms of, what are the slogans that we bring in? What are the alliances that we make? And how do we position ourselves, both in relationship to the state actors, let's say in Canada, in relationship to Canadian government, which has refused, in spite of 2 years of calls for arms embargo against Israel, which refuses to acknowledge even the fact that there is Canadian manufacturers, companies are sending arms through the US to Israel, and now obviously to parts that are being used in US military. So how do we address this, the complicity of our governments in this process, in this war? And how do we make alliances on the ground? Who do we make these alliances with? So I'd like to invite you, if you can comment on that, because I know that this is forefront in our mind. Asu, go ahead.
I mute myself. So I'm going to start with saying that solidarity or a true solidarity doesn't come from above, it comes from the below. And resistance also doesn't come from above, it comes from the below. A true no to war is a no to war and takes the positive politics, the positive political stance, not just denying one side or taking the part of brutal government. And I'm gonna mentioning the Khomeini sentence to remember something and ask you to remember how important this war is for IRI. And while, yes, the international coalition violated the so-called international law, but it doesn't mean that IRI hasn't had any expansionist ambitions and so on. Khomeini has said the war is blessing for us, and this sentence was his was the pillar of his ideas speech during the Iran and Iraq war, because you know and I know and he knows and everybody know that they can consolidate power during and after the war. War gives them an exceptional moment to suspend all the normal laws and reinforce and reconstruct what people have pushed back and reconstruct by their resistance over time. So from my position, any support for the IRI under the guise of anti-imperialism is support for a criminal, authoritarian, capitalist regime. The true democracy is not a gift. Is not a gift from elites, but it is something, a popular insurgency from below. So for the Iranian context, I named, you can find these insurgency in the resistance of women against gender oppression, the labor movement fighting for independent unions, and the national struggle of oppressed nations, Kurds, Arabs, Baluch, Turkmens, and so on, who are the primary targets of the state's unitary violence. I think to stand with the Iranian people means recognizing that the IRI is a pillar of the regional exploitation, not anti-imperialist governments. Thank you.
Niloofar, go ahead.
As someone who is active in movements here in Canada and that are non-Iranian, I would say the true solidarity is to really organize against rise of fascism in the West. Because as long as we have forms of different forms of right-wing politics in power, we're gonna see more and more militarization. We're gonna see more and more arm export, more extraction. That is feeding and living on authoritarianism, limitation of democracy even here, and also kind of like more and more militarization all over. So if we want to be anti-war and anti-authoritarianism elsewhere, we should start at home and like organize for system change here, not just like these issues here and there that many movements are doing, like decolonial, anti-colonial environmentalists are doing, parts of labor are doing, but very like in a very disorganized and like have lost the major political sphere to the right wing, and in some cases to fascist kind of like politics that are rising. And I see that as a main issue and main battleground here, instead of like undermining suffering of other people elsewhere in name of resistance.
Thank you. So I think you responded to the question that was put in the chat, which is what is the alternative solutions instead of war? So I would imagine that we all agree that war is not a solution to the Islamic Republic. War and foreign intervention is not a solution to dealing with the Islamic Republic. I think from our what you have described and our direct experience as people who saw myself and Shokoufeh, at least, if not the younger people amongst us, we saw the experience of the Iran-Iraq war and the way that that war consolidated the power of the state, the repressive power of the state, and undermined the possibility of any democratic polity in Iran. And in fact was solidified the ideological hold, not just the militarized hold, but also the ideological hold of the Islamic Republic. That solution, we can't look at a foreign imposed war as the solution to getting rid of the Islamic Republic. Does anybody disagree with that? Okay, great. I also wanted to actually mention something as we thinking about what are the ways that people in Iran have what are the life-affirming practices, as Nassaran so beautifully put it, that people are using inside Iran even now. And one of the ways in which people are, in the absence of the state's assistance and support of people, people are themselves are forming mutual aid groups, whether in the form of these bartering groups, whether in the form of lending, banks, or they're setting up informal banks where people can take a loan. Everybody pitches in and everybody can take a loan from. People are also helping, particularly there's large numbers of people who have been displaced, who've lost their livelihood as a result of the war, and people are assisting. And at the same time, as I know directly because I've been involved in this in the past few weeks, that the people who have been those grassroots mutual aid organizations or those grassroots support organizations are under increasing scrutiny by the government at the moment. And in fact, some of them have had to stop working because people have been arrested or people have been warned, and the streets in Iran are now under direct control of military control of the Islamic Republic and its many forces. The other thing that's important to remember is that, and this is a note that a message that has been sent to all the phones in Iran, is that they are now recruiting children age 14 and up in the war effort. And those of us who remember the Iran-Iraq war remember that catastrophe and the number of very young children who were killed in that war. And we are going back to that again. So war is not a solution. War is not going to liberate people. I want to invite, we have only a few more minutes left. I want to invite, if there are other questions that people have, the audience have, or if there are final comments that any of our speakers want to make before we wrap up. Okay.
I can see that Shokoufeh's hand is up.
Oh, I didn't see that. Shokoufeh, please go ahead.
I think bringing our attention, following what Nilu also said, is about the bringing our attention as a Canadian citizens at the same time. We are Canadian citizens to the local, to our own, this local national politics is very important here. The Carney government, it's the militarization, the investment that they're doing in the military, the whole Russian into militarization, rush into securitization of the society. These are all hand in hand, and the rise of the patriarchal sentiment, the male, this some I call it toxic masculinity. We see that rises even in schools, in high schools. We need to see the connection between all of this together, and then to bring a movement of against all of these wars, because these wars, as I said, as I'm afraid, they're not going to end. I mean, these are not something that it's going to just end by itself and go back to normal again. That's the thing. There is no normal again. There is no going back the way that we were living. We are moving rapidly through destruction of the whole order, the whole international order that we were existing. It's making ourselves and making even the youth here, and the young people. I'm saying that because I'm considering myself of the people, the age of the people who are leaving soon, but the people that this is the future that they're going to live. So bringing that message home, that this war is not happening on the other side of the world, and it's not the war of others. It is the war for us here. And yes, people are feeling it on the gas stations, but the feeling but it's more than just a little bit of inflation. It's whole way of it's everything is changing. So we need to actually expand our understanding of what is imperialism. I'm just repeating myself, but acting as Canadian citizens and make the connection between these wars and to what's happening in Canada is important too. Thank you.
Thank you. A question came from the chat. We have very few minutes left, so I'd like you to comment briefly. The question is, can you address the argument that some anti-imperialists in the West can't afford to address Iran's repressive state apparatus without the risk of feeding Islamophobia here in the West? So if we criticize the Islamic Republic, we will be equated with Islamophobes. And surprisingly, I have to say, I just need to make this comment myself. It's so similar to if we criticize Israel, we are anti-Semitic, isn't it? The similarity between what is happening in the way we are looking at Israel, what is happening in Israel, what happens in the Islamic Republic, and what happens in the United States is uncanny. And, the questions are even the same, right? So it's a very important question, and I'd like us to address it. Thank you, Niloofar. Start, please.
Just want to shortly say, it also romanticizes one group of people, in this case, Muslims. And I don't want to get into that. Well, people in Iran, many of them are not Muslims. We have this, we have that. We have so many different religions. Many of us consider ourselves non-religious at all, atheists, this and that. So obviously, but this argument simply, again, is lazy politics. It simplifies the situation and also romanticize Muslims. Muslims can be evil. Muslims can be good. That Muslims can be any spectrum of people, and we are dealing with a political system that it has been built on kind of like Sharia law to criminalize and build an extremely exclusive kind of like society with many groups who do not belong to that little circle as being second class, third class, fourth class citizen based on their identities and where they stand. So these are like, it's simple actually humanization of the people. Give them subjectivity of being anything besides just a good like kind of like category that we cannot touch. If we touch often so many bad things gonna happen. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to comment on that? Okay. We are close to 7 o'clock. Beverly, would you like to, actually, maybe before we end, I would like to thank the SSL team. I would like to acknowledge the work of Alessandro Jordan, the program streamer, Wad Judah, social media and website management, and Hadley House, artistic creator and designer, and I apologize if I slayed your names. I thank you, the speakers. This was a very rich session, and I hope we can build on it. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, the same. Yes.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Beverly, I'm not sure if Beverly is still online or if Beverly had any last, any closing. Okay, we are done, everyone. See you on the streets.
Bye.
Yes. Bye.
Okay, thank you so